Were you aware that the average high school romance typically lasts about 3 weeks? Well, Kelly Turner and Scott Howard shattered that statistic with a relationship that spanned an impressive 40 years. They first met when Kelly was a freshman and Scott was a sophomore. From that moment on, they were inseparable. Their love was genuine, almost legendary, and it withstood the test of time without losing its luster. Interestingly, Kelly and I were married for around 30 of those years, and during that time, I truly believed our happiness was real. Our marriage was fulfilling, and the birth of our daughter Jane only strengthened our bond. Generally, I felt content during those years. Allow me to introduce myself and share some background on this significant part of my life. I'm Tom Mitchell, and Kelly has been my devoted wife for nearly 3 decades. As I mentioned, Kelly and Scott were high school sweethearts, and yes, she lost her innocence to him. It's well known that most high school romances eventually fizzle out, but theirs seemed more like a pause. Since Scott was a year ahead in school, he aspired to build his wealth after graduation to marry Kelly. This was a story my wife often recounted throughout our marriage. After high school, Scott took a job on a pipeline in Alaska with his uncle, which marked the beginning of complications. Scott stopped writing shortly after arriving, leaving Kelly alone during her senior year. She briefly dated a guy named Sam, but her heart was still set on Scott. Despite Kelly's patient waiting, Scott remained absent and silent. It turned out he found fulfillment in the pipeline work and adopted a somewhat nomadic lifestyle, believing that Kelly was still waiting for him to return wealthy and sweep her off her feet. However, life goes on, and nothing stays the same. Kelly moved on, pursued higher education, earned her degree, and met me at a party when she was 24. Though I was a bit older at 29, we complemented each other well. I fell for her instantly and believe she felt the same about me. Our marriage was mostly typical, except for a hiccup 2 days before our wedding when a letter from Scott arrived asking Kelly to meet him. Thankfully, Kelly's mother stepped in, advising her to focus on her new life and not waste time on Scott. After some emotional moments during which I feared she might call off the wedding, she married me and became Mrs. Kelly Mitchell. By the time Scott resurfaced, we were already on our honeymoon, and in his despair, he apparently enlisted in the Marines. After our honeymoon, we settled into our new routines, with Kelly working as a nurse and me as an insurance adjuster for a major company. While our marriage remained strong, there was a recurring issue. Scott began texting Kelly, and she responded willingly. When I questioned this, she became defensive, insisting he was just an old friend who needed support. I was aware of their correspondence and her reciprocal letters. Despite efforts from both her family and myself, she persisted until news arrived that he had married someone at his station, ending their communication and restoring my peace of mind. Over the next 3 years, she received just 3 Christmas cards from Scott, and that was the extent of it. During this pause in communication with Scott, our daughter Jane was born. With our newborn in tow, Kelly and I worked diligently to build a home and farm to provide Jane with a good life. Those were indeed good days, and we worked together harmoniously to raise our child. However, as often happens, a disruption arose. One day, Kelly received a letter from Scott. Although she never discussed it, I noticed our stamp consumption increasing, leading me to conclude she had resumed correspondence with him. Despite this, I chose to overlook it, considering his duty to protect democracy while I ensured my family's well-being. If they chose to write to each other, I deemed it their business, regardless of my sentiments. Eventually, Kelly began sharing tidbits she had gleaned from Scott. He had divorced his first wife but remarried, seen combat, and was apparently highly decorated. While I listened with only partial attention, Kelly spoke with pride about her former Marine. I gently corrected her, reminding her he preferred to be called a Marine, not a soldier. Kelly chuckled sweetly and remarked that she should be cautious. Watching her discuss him saddened me, yet I hoped she would move on and focus on our family. Unfortunately, that day never came. Scott had served in the Marines for 30 years, experienced 3 marriages and divorces, and garnered enough medals to rival General Patton. I realized with dismay that while Scott had become more charming to my wife over the years, I had simply grown older and more predictable. My only solace was the hope that Scott, upon discharge, would settle far from us. Regrettably, that was not the case. Our daughter Jane is now a grown woman, married to a wonderful man named Henry Foster. Even more delightful news is that they are expecting their first child. At 60, I eagerly anticipate reaching the milestone age of 65 when I can retire and enjoy my remaining years in peace and tranquility. Kelly still looks as radiant as ever and has the ability to make my heart skip a beat. Little did I realize that the peace in my life would soon be shattered. One Thursday, upon returning home, I found Kelly dressed impeccably, informing me of a dinner reservation at 7. Initially perplexed, I searched my memory for any forgotten anniversary or birthday, only to realize that was not the case. So I went along with it, heading to our bedroom to freshen up and attempt to match Kelly's elegance. Dinner was fantastic, and the restaurant was crowded, leading me to suspect Kelly had more on her mind than just enjoying the food. As we neared the end of our meal, I leaned in and said, "All right, Kelly, spill it. I'm in a good mood and won't make a scene." One of my quirks is that I never lose my cool in public. Years in the insurance industry have trained me to keep my composure, a habit that's carried into my personal life. Kelly knew this well, so whenever she had troubling news, she'd choose a public setting to deliver it. Tonight, something felt off just by looking at her face. After 30 years together, you get good at reading your partner. I had a sinking feeling tonight, convinced something would ruin my evening. Finally, with evident hesitation, she broke the silence. "Tom, you should know that Scott is back." Instantly, a wave of nausea hit me, though I knew it wasn't the food. I stared at her, waiting for more details, but Kelly just gazed back at me with a somber expression. Finally, I broke the awkward silence. "When you say back, do you mean from a vacation?" She shook her head and replied softly, "No, Tom. He was discharged from the army and bought a house 2 streets away from us." My anxiety spiked and I interrupted. "And he's moving in with his, what, third wife?" She replied quietly, "No, he's divorced again, and he lost part of his pension because of her." Trying to contain my anger, I muttered, "Damn, this is too much." Some nearby diners glanced our way. My frustration wasn't about Scott losing his pension, but because he had moved so close, and I needed to understand why. I pressed on. "Kelly, you haven't met up with Scott, have you?" Her face gave me the answer. She didn't even respond when I followed up. "When and how did this happen, Kelly?" She looked downcast and said, "Yesterday. He came by our house to tell me we're now neighbors." My heart pounded as I continued questioning, fearing the worst. "Did you sleep with him, Kelly?" Her expression revealed everything before she admitted, "I did, Tom. But it's not what you think." I glared at her, almost growling. "I believe my wife cheated on me. Now explain why this isn't what I think it is." "He needed me, Tom. When he came to me, he seemed so lost. He's struggling with anxiety or something from the divorce, and he needed me desperately. I love you, Tom, but I realize I still love Scott too." There it was. My wife had slept with Scott, using his PTSD and divorce as a way back into her heart and bed. I looked her straight in the eye and said firmly, "All right, Kelly, the damage is done. We can work through this, but you can't sleep with him again. Understand?" She tearfully replied, "I can't promise that, Tom. I love him, and he needs me more than you." Hearing that was devastating, but a public restaurant wasn't the place for our private drama. I signaled for the bill. 10 minutes later, we were in the car heading home when I brought it up again. "Kelly, how can you be with him knowing you're married? Have you forgotten our vows from nearly 30 years ago? Remember, forsaking all others." She began sobbing and between her tears confessed, "I'm sorry, Tom, but he needs me, and we found each other again. I can't bear the thought of losing either of you." I was at a loss for what to say or do to make her let him go. Frustrated, I exclaimed, "What then? Should we take turns? He gets you on New Year's and I get you on Christmas? Stop it, Kelly. You can't have 2 men." She stopped crying and gave me a strange look. "How about a break, Tom?" I was taken aback. "What are you suggesting, Kelly?" She shifted the topic. "Remember 18 years ago when you took a year off to get your master's degree? You did what you needed to and came back, and everything was fine." I shook my head irritably. "Kelly, how can you compare me getting a degree that benefited our family to your involvement with Scott, which benefits only the 2 of you?" By this point, I pulled into our driveway and turned off the engine. Kelly reached out and touched my face lovingly, pleading, "Tom, I missed my last year of high school with Scott. And if I had that year, we might not be here tonight. Give me this year, and I'll get Scott out of my system. I promise to be the best wife to you. I need this time, Tom, please. I felt a storm of emotions: sadness, hurt, shock, and depression. The urge to lash out surged within me, but I recalled stories about men who lost their freedom in fits of rage. I said, "All right, Kelly, if this is truly what you want, go ahead. But understand this: don't expect my approval. I don't want to see or hear from you for the entire year. Got it? And know that in a year, you might have no one to come back to." I hoped my strict conditions might deter her, but it seemed futile. She appeared deaf to my words, agreeing and kissing my cheek, expressing gratitude and assuring me I wouldn't regret it. I shook my head, telling her it was too late and I already regretted it. That night, she wanted to be close, but I ignored her. The thought of her with Scott made me feel sick, and I couldn't bear the idea of physical closeness. As we prepared for bed, I took a pillow and informed her I'd sleep in the guest room. I noticed this deeply hurt her, and part of me was glad, hoping she might reconsider. The following morning, I woke up hoping last night was just a bad dream, and that Kelly would have a change of heart. I was wrong. In the kitchen, she was making breakfast, looking as if she had just won the lottery. She smiled at me and pointed to the calendar on the wall. Today's date, June 6th, was circled with a thick black line. Sitting at the table, I thought about the irony. In 1944, thousands fought to liberate Europe from tyranny, and today, I lost my wife to another form of oppression. Kelly seemed almost euphoric as she served breakfast, saying, "I understand your concerns, Tom, but a year from today, I'll return and be solely yours. I need this time to sort things out and clear my head, and I promise you won't regret it." She smiled contentedly before continuing, "I called Scott this morning while you were still asleep and told him you agreed to my vacation. He'll pick me up in an hour." Every word she spoke made my heart sink, but I felt compelled to give her another chance. "Kelly, you don't have to do this. Take more time to reconsider. You can't be sure that in a year you'll be free of him. Focus on freeing yourself from his hold and repairing our marriage. Don't risk destroying what we have." She grinned at me with an air of superiority and spoke gently. "Tom, I appreciate the love you've shown by granting me this time. Trust me, I know what I'm doing." "Our marriage will be even stronger when I return, Tom," she said confidently. "Now I need to finish packing, so please eat your breakfast." With those words, she left the kitchen, effectively marking her emotional departure from our relationship. Despite the tasteless meal, I forced myself to finish eating and then went to get dressed. Entering our bedroom, I was met with the sight of Kelly's 3 large suitcases, all packed and ready. She smiled at me with a mix of affection and determination and said, "I think I've got everything. Please take these bags to the porch for Scott." I stared at her in disbelief before saying, "No." Her face registered shock at my refusal. Continuing, I added, "If you're determined to throw away 30 years of marriage, you and that man can carry your bags yourselves. I won't help you in this ridiculous endeavor. Is that clear?" Kelly seemed on the verge of tears before snapping back, "Scott is not ridiculous. He's a wonderful man and a hero who served our country. He's done more than you ever have." I turned away, muttering, "Yes, he has medals, while I've worked 5 days a week to provide for you and our daughter. But sure, that was meaningless." Kelly struggled to haul her luggage downstairs, glaring at me with every trip. Soon after, a car pulled up, and a man I assumed to be Scott started loading her bags. Kelly called out to him, "I'll be right there," before coming back to say goodbye. We stood facing each other awkwardly until I broke the silence. "If you're really going through with this, remember the terms: no contact for the entire year." I could see reality starting to hit her as she replied meekly, "I understand, Tom, but it'll all work out. You'll see. Remember, you agreed to give me this year." She waited for my response, but I stayed silent. Finally, looking more uncertain, she said softly, "I really do love you." She leaned in for a kiss, but I turned away so she settled for a touch on my cheek. Hastily, I said, "I can't kiss you knowing you're going to him." Tears streamed down her face as she rushed out of the house and into his arms. From the doorway, I watched her embrace him passionately, feeling rage boil within me. 2 minutes later, my driveway was empty, reflecting the emptiness inside me as I realized my wife was now with another man. I called in sick to work that morning and headed straight to the hardware store to buy new locks. I spent the entire morning changing every lock on the house and updating the security codes. This task kept me busy and distracted, but once I finished, the sadness crashed over me like a tidal wave. In my despair, I did what many do. I turned off our home phone and started drinking heavily. Though I hoped to numb the pain of losing Kelly, it was a futile effort. My drinking binge continued until Sunday morning when I ran out of alcohol, which was a small relief as I felt utterly drained. I finally went to bed and fell into a deep, troubled sleep, only to be awakened by persistent knocking. Groggy, I stumbled around to find my daughter Jane at the door. When I let her in, she looked horrified by my disheveled state and the strong smell of alcohol. "Dad, what's going on?" she demanded. I struggled to focus through the haze in my head and mumbled, "What do you mean?" She gave me a concerned look, guiding me to the kitchen. "You need coffee and food, Dad. Then you can explain what's been happening." An hour later, with food in my stomach and a cup of coffee in my hand, I told her everything I knew about her mother and Scott. Her reaction was one of utter shock. "Dad, let me get this straight. Mom is taking a year-long break from our marriage to rekindle things with her high school boyfriend." I nodded, saying yes, something like that. Her questions echoed the ones I had been wrestling with. "What's your plan, Dad?" I looked her in the eyes and said, "Tomorrow, I'm calling in sick again and consulting a lawyer." Jane looked heartbroken and suggested, "I can't believe Mom would do this. Maybe she's having a mental breakdown." I replied blankly, "I honestly don't know, Jane." She looked at me with a sorrowful expression I hadn't seen before. "I'm at a loss, Dad. I want to tell you to reconsider, but this seems like your best option." Jane stayed with me for several hours, even preparing dinner before she left. She kissed me goodbye and apologized again before departing. I asked, "Why did you come today?" She looked at me sadly. "Mom called and asked me to check on you. She didn't say why or where she was." I nodded, pretending to understand. "All right, thanks, and drive safely, dear." I felt terrible on Monday but had a meeting with a lawyer. My suspicions about Kelly were confirmed. The divorce proceedings would lean in my favor due to her infidelity, preventing her from claiming half my pension. However, other shared assets remained unresolved. This break could present an opportunity to settle those matters. The next 3 weeks flew by, and I was surprised by how easily I adapted to being alone. On the positive side, I no longer felt the burden of being responsible for another person. However, the downside was the loneliness of waking up and going to bed alone. I didn't hear from Kelly until mid-July. One Saturday, I visited a posh tavern in town. While I sat at the bar, they walked in, holding hands like love-struck teenagers, completely oblivious to my presence. Watching them, I saw Scott's muscular, moderately attractive appearance and understood Kelly's attraction. However, he seemed controlling, and she followed his lead submissively. He talked, and she listened intently. As she headed to the restroom, she finally noticed me and gave a timid smile. When she came out, she approached me hesitantly. "Hello, Tom. How are you?" Despite my urge to lash out, I kept my cool and replied, "Oh, as well as one can be when their wife of 30 years leaves for another man. What do you need?" My sarcastic tone confused her, but she held her ground. "Tom, I need to get into the house. I left some personal things there, but my key didn't work when I tried the other day." I smiled, maintaining a friendly tone. "Well, Kelly, it shouldn't surprise you that your key doesn't work in my house since you don't live there anymore." She looked puzzled as I continued, "I think you better get back to your boyfriend before he gets worried." Tears welled up in her eyes as she turned and walked away. I resumed focusing on my drink. 2 minutes later, I felt a rough hand on my shoulder, spinning me around to face an angry Scott. "Hey, idiot, you made my woman cry and I don't like it." He looked ready to hit me, and my heart raced, knowing he could overpower me before anyone could intervene. Summoning more courage than I felt, I went on the offensive. "You're talking about my wife, not your woman. Since you stole her, you have no right to interfere in our matters. Hit me if you want, but think about what happens when the police get involved," I snapped, holding my ground. I could see Scott struggling to process my words, knowing he wasn't exactly the brightest bulb in the box. This gave me the confidence to press on. "You have 2 choices. Punch me and spend time in jail, or walk away and mind your own business." My heart raced as I spoke, but I maintained a facade of bravado. Scott glared at me, fists clenched, But before he could decide, the manager approached us, asking if there was a problem. Scott shot him a look of contempt before muttering, "No problem," and slinking back toward Kelly. 5 minutes later, they settled their bill and left. On the drive home, my mind raced with thoughts about what personal items Kelly might want from the house. Determined to find out, I spent hours searching through every nook and cranny. Finally, buried beneath some old clothes in her closet, I found a stack of letters from Scott to Kelly. As I read through them, it became clear that their affair had been brewing for years. One letter, dated 5 years earlier, read, "It's comforting to know you still miss me. When I come back, we'll be together. You'll have to find a way to get rid of your weak husband." Reading through the letters felt like leafing through a tawdry romance novel. Many detailed their plans or reminisced about their high school days. By the time I finished, it was evident that life without Kelly was going to be simpler, albeit lonelier. I didn't hear from Kelly until my birthday on September 1st. Coming home from work, I found a covered dish and a birthday card on the porch. Bringing them inside, I saw she had made my favorite stew. The card read, "Happy birthday, Tom," with a note inside. "I know we're not supposed to communicate, but I couldn't ignore your birthday. I dream about us every night, and by the end of this year I will be yours, and he will be gone. Please never stop loving me or abandon us. Love, Kelly." My daughter Jane had been keeping a close eye on me since Kelly left. She called me on my birthday. After some small talk, she got to the point. "Dad, you know my due date is in 3 weeks, right?" "Of course, honey. How could I forget? Your mom and I are thrilled about the birth of our first grandchild." There was a brief pause before Jane continued. "Dad, Henry and I had dinner with Mom and Scott last night. Mom wants to be there when the baby is born, and she wants Scott to be there too. I know you and Mom agreed not to communicate for a year, but can you make an exception for me, just this once?" The news that Jane and her husband had dined with them stunned me, but I didn't want to ruin the occasion of my first grandchild's birth. "All right, Jane, she can come, and she can bring him if necessary." Jane immediately corrected me. "Dad, stop calling him him. He's not a bad guy and he makes Mom happy. I haven't seen her this joyful in years." Anger surged through me. "Your grandmother had strong words for him years ago, and nothing has changed. Now you're all dining together and you're defending him. He's slowly tearing our family apart. Just tell me, when are you going to start calling him Dad?" Jane quickly responded, her regret clear. "Dad, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it like that. I can imagine how you feel, and I'm truly sorry." I cut her off coldly. "It's okay, forget about it. I have something in the oven. Behave yourself." She said she loved me and hung up. It was then that I realized my life would never be the same, and I needed to take action. First, I began liquidating my assets to reduce my net worth. Second, I faced my fears and re-entered the world. The next few days were stressful. I sought legal advice on asset management, obtained a stun gun for self-defense in case of a confrontation with Scott, and booked a trip to Las Vegas for October. Additionally, I started searching for companionship online, hoping to find a woman my age looking for a stable, long-term relationship. With Kelly gone, I had the freedom to use or dispose of my possessions as I saw fit, giving me significant control over my future plans. The day Jane went into labor, I was at work. My secretary answered the phone. It was Henry, elated to tell me I was a grandfather. I congratulated him and rushed to the hospital. Upon arriving, I found Jane's room and headed there. As I approached the door, I overheard a heated conversation between Jane and Kelly. "Mom, this whole situation with Dad is pointless. Do you really want to lose him for Scott?" Jane asked, clearly frustrated. Kelly responded reassuringly, "Don't worry, Jane, I won't lose your father. His love for me is too strong for him to leave. Besides, what I have with Scott is amazing. Every day feels like high school again, only better now that we're physically together. He treats me like a princess, and I'll miss this when I go back to your father." Jane's voice dripped with disdain. "Mom, I don't want to hear about your love life with Scott. I know he's a great guy and all, but I want my child to have grandparents who are together, not separated. Please, Mom, go back to Dad before it's too late. He might be dull and predictable, but he's always there for you. Scott might be charming now, but all good things come to an end. Dad is constant. He won't abandon you. Do whatever it takes to win him back." There was a brief silence before Jane pleaded, "Mom, don't wait too long, or you might lose him." Kelly's voice was confident but misguided. "You don't need to worry about your father and me. When I'm done with Scott, Your father will welcome me back with open arms. Jane's skepticism was clear. Mom, you think you know Dad, but he's changing. He's more bitter and distant since you left. Are you really willing to throw away 30 years of marriage for a high school fling? Having heard enough, I stepped into the room with a forced smile. Hey, Jane, congratulations on your new son. You must be thrilled. I went over and hugged her, deliberately ignoring Kelly. It was childish, but it felt necessary at the moment. Kelly glared at me, but Jane beamed. Have you seen him yet, Dad? I shook my head. No, sweetie. I came to check on you first. Tired of the tension, Kelly finally spoke. Hello, Tom. How are you? I glanced at her briefly, then focused back on Jane, asking about the birth and the baby's name. At the mention of the name, Jane's face lit up. Henry and I decided to name him Thomas, after you, Dad. Kelly, looking solemn, excused herself, saying she was going to see the baby. Once she left, I took Jane's hands and spoke seriously. Jane, you know your mom and I probably won't reconcile. Jane's eyes filled with tears. No, Dad, I don't believe that. She'll come to her senses soon and come back home. Tears welled up in my eyes as I spoke softly. Baby, I've come to realize I was never enough for your mother. Something significant is going to happen soon. Shock and disbelief crossed her face as she asked, What do you mean, Dad? I gave her a sad smile. Very soon, I'll be starting the divorce proceedings after I get a few things sorted out. Her eyes filled with tears as she replied, Oh, Dad, I told Mom she should beg you to come back, but it's too late now, isn't it? I nodded, the pain evident in my voice. Yes, it's too late for reconciliation. The memories of her betrayal are too painful for me to overcome. But please, don't say anything to her just yet, okay? Jane nodded and hugged me tightly. We chatted for a while longer, carefully avoiding any mention of Kelly or Scott. Eventually, I promised to visit the next day and left her to bond with the baby. As I made my way to the children's ward, I found my grandson among the other newborns. The sight of his tiny, precious form struck me with a profound sense of beauty and fragility. Just then, Henry approached, standing between Kelly, Scott, and me with a warm smile. He handed me a cigar, saying, Here, Dad, have a smoke to celebrate. I slipped the cigar into my pocket and patted Henry on the back. I'll save this for later, son. Thank you. Watching my wife and her lover holding hands like infatuated teenagers made my stomach churn. Henry, I'll come back tomorrow when it's less crowded and the air is a bit fresher, if you know what I mean. Henry nodded, understanding. I get it, Dad. I don't blame you one bit. As I was about to leave, Kelly called out to me timidly, Tom, it feels like just yesterday we were bringing our baby home, and now our baby has one of his own. Time flies so fast. I glanced at her, she still holding Scott's hand, and walked out without a word. She looked confused as I left them standing there. October arrived, turning out to be the best month I had experienced since Kelly left. I took a trip to Vegas, initially planning to lose some money at the tables as an excuse to diminish our shared assets. However, the trip took an unexpected turn when I met Sabrina, a sophisticated woman in her 50s. She explained that many men seek the company of an older woman, and in my case, she was right. Sabrina was expensive, but she made me feel more alive than I had in years. For the first time since Kelly left, I didn't miss her at all. Sabrina was not only skilled in bed, but also genuinely interested in me. She asked about my soon-to-be ex-wife and her new partner, and by the end of the night, she knew almost as much about my life as I did. Moved by my story, she gently touched my face before leaving. Tom, I've only known you for a few hours, but I feel I must tell you something. You're a good person, and that's rare. I've seen and been with thousands of men, and I can count on one hand those I truly liked and respected. You're one of them. Your wife has no idea what she's losing. Don't let her actions and foolishness change who you are, and if you ever come back to town, call me. I'd love to see you again. My trip to Vegas and Sabrina's words left me more introspective than ever. Reflecting on what she said, I realized she was right. Despite Kelly's 3 decades of being a devoted wife and mother before her betrayal, I couldn't let this marriage break me. Upon returning from Vegas, I instructed my lawyer to start drafting the divorce papers. Additionally, I decided to dig deeper into Scott Howard's background. Following my lawyer's advice, I hired a private investigation firm to look into his past, from high school to the present. Despite the firm's hefty fees, I didn't hesitate. knowing that half the expenses would be covered by Kelly's share. Confident in the firm's thoroughness, I expected to have all the information I needed before Christmas. I also approached my boss about transferring to another branch of our company. Initially surprised by my request, given my previous resistance to relocating, he promised to look into it and get back to me. As Thanksgiving approached, I faced another challenge. Jane called me about a week before the holiday to invite me to dinner. When I asked if her mother and her new partner would be there, she hesitantly confirmed. Hearing this, I declined firmly and ended the call. Unexpectedly, my brother-in-law reached out to me soon after. Henry called my office and requested a meeting. We arranged to meet at a quiet bar in the city center. That evening, I noticed Henry was visibly upset. After some initial small talk, I ordered 2 double scotches and sensed something was troubling him. I leaned back, ready to listen as Henry began to open up about the situation with my wife and daughter. "Dad, you won't believe this, but they're both infatuated with him. It's all Scott this and Scott that." "You'd think he was some kind of hero," Henry said, taking a sip of his drink. I was taken aback by his honesty and needed to understand his perspective. "So, Henry, do I understand correctly that you don't approve of Mr. Howard?" Henry's face contorted with anger. "Dad, this guy is arrogant, self-centered, and selfish. He's so in love with himself that I can't see how he has any room left for Kelly." Realizing his outburst, he quickly apologized. "Sorry, Dad, I didn't mean to disrespect her." I smiled reassuringly. "No worries, son. I'm not offended. But tell me, when did you start calling her Kelly instead of Mom?" He seemed hurt. "Since she left you. I've lost all respect for her." Curious, I probed further. "Why did her departure affect you so much, if you don't mind me asking?" His face flushed with anger again. "I'm sure you noticed that during my time with Jane, I never talked about my parents, and I appreciate you never asking. The truth is, my mother cheated on my father. They split, and my dad never recovered. He drank himself into oblivion, and my mother died in a car accident with her lover. I despise cheaters, and now that Kelly has become one, I can't stand her. I'm pretending for Jane's sake, but I'm worried." I had never heard about Henry's parents before, and felt a deep sympathy for him. Yet I was intrigued by his concern. "Henry, you mentioned being worried. What's on your mind, son?" He took a deep drink, ordered another round, and then turned to me. "I might upset you with this, but you asked. The saying like mother, like daughter worries me. If Kelly has turned into a cheater and keeps praising it to Jane, how long before Jane gets tempted to stray too?" I raised my eyebrows at his concern. "I understand where you're coming from." I took a thoughtful sip of my drink, considering my next steps. "Listen, Henry, don't lose hope. I have some surprises up my sleeve, and I think things might start to change in the new year. Also, strictly between us, I've got plans to make this Christmas special for you and Jane, but not so much for others, if you catch my drift." Henry's smile appeared for the first time since we sat down, and he spent the next 15 minutes trying to extract more information from me, without success. As we wrapped up, I smiled again. "Aren't you forgetting something, Henry?" He looked puzzled. "What's that, Dad?" I put a hand on his shoulder. "Shouldn't you try to persuade me to come to Thanksgiving?" Henry's smile widened. "Oops. Okay. Will you come to Thanksgiving, Dad?" I shook my head. "No, but I appreciate the invite." Jane called twice more before Thanksgiving, pleading for my attendance, until I finally put my foot down. "Look, Jane, when your mother left me in June, I made it clear there'd be no contact for a year. She wanted to end our marriage. I've already broken that rule once for little Thomas's birth, but I won't break bread with them. Is that understood?" The holiday came, and I had a frozen dinner. I felt lonely and sad, but it was better than watching Kelly and Scott exchange affectionate looks. December arrived, bringing the prospect of another family holiday, which I dreaded. However, I knew it would be the last one I had to endure. December turned out to be quite eventful. Firstly, the company offered me a position in Spokane, Washington, starting in January, and I accepted it. Secondly, the private investigator's report on Scott Howard came through, and it was eye-opening. Scott had a history riddled with infidelity. 3 ex-wives had divorced him due to his cheating ways, and he had children from multiple women, each requiring child support payments. His last wife had taken half his pension in their divorce, and he had been demoted from an E8 to an E6 in his final year in the Corps. In short, His financial and moral standing was far from exemplary. The best part was that Kelly would receive her divorce papers on the first business day after Christmas. Ah, the holiday spirit was truly kicking in for me. I called Jane to discuss Christmas plans, and once again she insisted on a family gathering. When I asked if Scott would be attending, Jane got upset. "Dad, you need to accept that he's part of our family now, whether you like it or not." I cut her off. "Right, I don't like it, but for the child's sake, I'll be there." Jane seemed genuinely pleased. "Thank you, Dad. This will make everyone so happy." I doubted it, but I kept that to myself. 2 days later, after getting home from work, the phone rang. Instinctively, I answered. "Hello?" The line was silent for a moment, and I almost hung up when a hesitant voice finally responded. "Tom, it's Kelly." "What's wrong, Kelly? Are you hurt?" "No, I'm fine, Tom. I just wanted to thank you for agreeing to come for Christmas. I realize now how much I've hurt you. We've never spent a holiday apart in 30 years. Thanksgiving was miserable without you. I've been thinking about us a lot lately." I interrupted her. "Well, Kelly, I'm glad you're reflecting on us. But remember, when you initiated this separation, I insisted on no communication. I made an exception for Christmas Day, so let's end this conversation now. Goodbye." Hanging up, I felt a pang of guilt. I had never spoken to her so harshly in our entire marriage. But as guilty as I felt, it was nothing compared to the pain she caused me when she left. The month crawled by, giving me plenty of time to shop for Christmas gifts. I bought presents for everyone, packed my belongings for the new job, and rented a car for the cross-country drive. I also had a productive conversation with a woman at my new office who had found several well-appointed furnished apartments near my workplace. She even offered to personally show them to me when I arrived in Spokane. Everything was falling into place. On Christmas Day, I arrived at Jane and Henry's house, only to find Kelly and Scott already there. Jane greeted me warmly, expressing her happiness at my surprise visit, then returned to the kitchen. I smiled inwardly, knowing the real surprise was yet to come. Henry greeted me and took my coat. "Can I see my grandson?" I asked. "Of course," Henry replied. "He's asleep in the nursery, but you can peek in." I entered the nursery and looked at the sleeping baby, feeling a wave of emotion. Soon I would be leaving, unable to stay. Kelly appeared behind me, standing silently. It struck me as ironic that she should have been here since June. "We have a beautiful grandson, Tom," she whispered. "Yes, Kelly, but who will he call Grandpa? Me or Scott? Or both?" I replied, my voice tinged with sadness. "Why would you say that? You're the only grandfather this child will ever have," she said, surprised. "Let's hope you're right, Kelly," I murmured, then left the room. The next few hours were filled with superficial conversations. Henry and I talked, while Jane, Kelly, and Scott seemed lost in their own world. I was disappointed at how quickly my daughter had been charmed by Scott. Henry looked equally unhappy, but I reassured him that changes were coming. His eyes lit up with hope as he whispered, "I hope so, Dad. I can't stand that guy around her anymore. At this rate, he'll soon be cozying up to Jane." Dinner was served, and although the food was delicious, the company was unbearable. I had no desire to speak with Kelly or her partner, and Henry was too hesitant to say much. Scott dominated the conversation, regaling the women with exaggerated tales of his exploits. Watching him bask in their admiration made me feel ill. After dinner, Jane brought the baby into the living room and we all gathered around. It struck me that this might be the last time we were all together like this. Jane seemed happy as she instructed Henry to distribute the gifts. When he did, Jane gave presents to her mom, Scott, and me. Kelly received a sweater, Scott a gift card, and I got a tie. Practical but uninspired gifts, reflecting how they saw me. When Henry, Jane, and the baby unwrapped their presents from Kelly and Scott, Jane was delighted, while Henry remained polite but distant. As everyone finished opening their gifts, the room fell silent, and all eyes turned to me and my bag of presents. Breaking the silence, I said, "To conclude this wonderful evening, I want to give you all the gifts you deserve this holiday." Standing up, I retrieved the bag and handed Henry and Jane a large envelope wrapped in festive paper. Jane eagerly tore open the wrapping while Henry watched. Jane's joyful scream filled the room as she realized what was inside. Kelly shifted in her seat, eager to know. "What is it, Jane?" "Dad gave us your house for free. No mortgage, Now we can move out of this rental. Isn't that amazing? Jane exclaimed. Kelly's expression turned from joy to concern. Why did you do this, Tom? Where will we live? I fixed her with a piercing look. Don't worry, Kelly. I've got everything figured out. Here, this is for you. I handed her a card and a wrapped box. She unwrapped the box to find a bracelet. Her surprise was evident as she examined it. Look at the inscription. Kelly turned the bracelet over, revealing the words, "Thank you for the best 30 years of my life, Tom." I glanced at Scott, noting his displeasure. Tom, thank you. This is lovely, but you forgot to write with love, she said, puzzled. I didn't forget, Kelly. I chose not to lie. My love for you has faded these past months. This bracelet is my farewell, and a reminder of what you sacrificed for your partner. You'll also receive divorce papers on Monday. Jane gasped while Kelly's face contorted in disbelief and despair. I nodded toward the card. I tried to express gratitude for the good years and our daughter. There's also a check for half our liquid assets. Though it's not much, $195,000 spent during your absence. The house was intended for our daughter when you left our marriage. I explained it all in the card. Turning to Scott, I sensed the tension building. And this gift is for you. I handed Kelly another envelope. She looked stunned as she opened it. Inside is the full account of what your lover has been up to since high school. You'll find it enlightening. Before I could finish, Scott exploded. I'll ruin you, you! He collapsed as my stun gun made contact, ensuring he stayed down. Jane and Kelly stood up, horrified, as I administered another shock to Scott's groin to keep him incapacitated. Moving closer, I said, feeling the pain? It's nothing compared to losing the woman I loved for 30 years to a man like you. Kelly sobbed uncontrollably. I turned to her. I know I'm not as exciting as your sergeant, but I won't forget what you did. I administered another shock, enjoying his convulsions. This never gets old. Summoning more courage than I felt, I added, since you seem to enjoy your affair, I'm giving you the ultimate gift, Kelly. Freedom. Now you can live pampered by day and entertained by night. Perfect for a traitor like you. Kelly struggled to speak, tears streaming down her face. No, it wasn't supposed to be like this. I was going to come back to you in June, Tom. I love you. She trembled, and Jane rushed to her side. I zapped Scott once more before Henry intervened nervously. Dad, you might seriously hurt him. Standing over Scott, I looked at the two women I loved most. I'm leaving now. Thanks for the lovely day and the wonderful life. As for seeing me again, don't count on it. Both women were speechless, staring at me as if I were a stranger. Henry handed me my coat, grinning with satisfaction. Before leaving, I addressed Jane, who looked at me with fear for the first time. Jane, take this as a lesson. If you follow your mother's path, you'll lose everything. Your husband, your home, and the love of your life. I approached little Thomas's crib, touched his cheek, and whispered, Goodbye, baby. Maybe we'll meet again someday, but I doubt it. Still smiling, I headed for the door. Happy New Year, everyone. By the time I reached my car, the shock had likely worn off. I distinctly heard Kelly cry out, No, this can't be happening. Starting the engine, I thought about my new life in Spokane and the possibility of seeing Sabrina again. As I backed out, Henry emerged from the house, smiling and waving. I returned the gesture before driving off into a new life out west, feeling a mixture of relief and trepidation.